Thank you so much. Can you all hear me okay? Is that good? Okay. I'm glad to be here, and I was just talking with a few of you here, some who already have podcasts, some who are considering having podcasts, some who are thinking that podcasting is a complete mystery. And I hope by the end of this talk that you'll feel like podcasting is something that is doable and something that you can and should do to not only promote your books, but to connect and network with people across the industry. So that's going to be where we're headed during this talk. And of course, I'm always looking for feedback. If you have questions, if there's something that I say that you want clarified, feel free to speak up. We're not a huge group here, so we can use this time together to come away with a plan of action. So who is April O'Leary? That's me. And the I'm Book podcast. I was just asked right before this, when did you start podcasting? I actually started in February of 2020. I decided that it was 1 year into my publishing company, and I wanted to celebrate that success. We had published a number of really exciting books, had a lot of exciting success, and I wanted to create a platform for my authors to be able to share their stories with other people. And so sometimes being a guest on a podcast is a lot easier than creating your own podcast. And so I thought that could be a way I could serve my authors and bridge them into getting them familiar with and comfortable with interviewing and being on podcasts. And that was the reason I started mine back in February of 2020. And I had no idea really what I was doing or where it was going. I'm the type of person that sort of has an idea in the morning, and by the afternoon I've already written it out and I've launched a platform, and I don't know what I'm doing yet. But sometimes I think that's the best way to go about it, because we could spend a lot of time at the drawing board and planning and plotting and thinking and wondering what it would be like. And the truth is, sometimes you just have to get into the deep end and start doing it and know that you're going to be bad until you become good. And so just like if any of you have done videos, videos on YouTube, has anyone done video recordings or live videos? I'm streaming this live on Facebook, actually. You look back a few years ago, sometimes Facebook will remind me, this was 5 years ago. And I'm like, oh my God, the lighting was terrible. I wasn't smiling. I wasn't looking at the camera. But I had to start somewhere. And so this is what podcasting is about too, is understanding that you got to start somewhere. So I want to give you a little bit of the history of podcasting, because I find this very interesting, because podcasting is still a newer platform. It's a newer way to connect with readers. So in 2012, which was only 10 years ago, there was only 12,000 podcasts. And so this was kind of like the beginning when YouTube, remember, was new in the late 2006, 7, in that range. That was a very small but growing platform, and there's a lot of potential. 3 years later, it a little bit more than doubled to 28,000. I thought that's interesting, right? And then in 2019, there was a huge jump to 750,000 podcasts. Someone asked me right at the beginning, before the session started, how do you break through the noise? Because there are so many podcasts, but those of us who are here, we are authors as well. And so we could easily look on Amazon and say, there's millions and millions of books. Why should I write a book? Who's going to read my book? Well, new books, new popular books get brought to the market all the time. Why not you? So then in 2022, there were 2 million podcasts. Isn't that amazing? So we went in just one decade from 12,000 podcasts to 2 million. And who knows where it's going to go in the next 10 years. Here's some podcast statistics, total percentage of listeners. This is of across the US. 62% of people over 12 listen to podcasts. And I think that's a pretty significant number of people. 26% of those people who are podcast listeners listen weekly. And I think that's also interesting to know. And then speaking of the people who are listening and the demographic of those people, you've got most of them, 66% have a college degree, and they earn $75,000 or more annually. So these are people who are probably also reading and buying books. This is a more educated platform. This is where people who want to learn spend their time. and I skipped one last one here, and 22% of people that are over 55 listen to podcasts at least monthly. So I think these are all encouraging numbers to know that it's a large pool of people. So just like writing and creating a book, you can find your listeners, know that they're out there, and if you can create something where they're interested and they want to listen, they will stick around and listen. So how do people find podcasts? If you're a person who's interested in podcasts or you've discovered them, think about how did you hear about them? Well, 17% of people find them on social media. And I've done that. I've found podcasts I like on social media, through Instagram, through Facebook, through LinkedIn. People have posted, hey, I was on this show, and then I'll check out that show and I'll start becoming a listener, or I'll subscribe. Word of mouth, friends, 19%. You know, have you ever shared a book that you love with a friend? That's like the golden ticket that all authors hope for. They hope to get that book that gets recommended over and over and over again. There's a book that my husband said I should have earned royalties on called Baby Wise. I read this one right before I had my first child, who is now 20. She lives here in Orlando. And it was some lady, she was hosting like a Pampered Chef party, something like that. She was pregnant with her 4th child. And she said in passing, oh, you have to get this book, Baby Wise. It'll help you get your baby to sleep. I was like, oh, that sounds good. I don't want a baby that's crying all night. So I was young, I was 23. I didn't know anything about how to get babies on a schedule. So I read this book, and within 8 weeks, my baby was sleeping through the night. And then since anytime I see someone who's pregnant, or that I say, you have to get the book Baby Wise, it saved my life. To this day, I still do that. Now I'm a little bit more cautious because I know people don't always like sleep training. It's not as in trend as it used to be maybe, but you know, that author changed my life, and I kept telling that story over and over and recommending it, and that's what can happen with podcasts as well. It's so parallel. And then 30%, surprisingly, is through internet searches. So just by showing up and being online and having that tool of podcasting, you can get people to your website. You can get people to know more about you. Now, this is where I think it becomes very interesting for us as authors and publishers. Now, there's 2 different ways that we can talk about podcasting for authors. One of them is being a guest on other people's podcasts. And the second way is have your own podcast. And so these statistics I'm going to share on these next 2 slides have to do with both ways, okay? So the 90% of USA Today best-selling authors, they are regular guests on podcasts. So 90% of authors are now showing up on podcasts. It might not be their own podcast, but they understand the medium and they understand how to go about securing those interviews and promoting. So sort of like we all know blog tours, right? Like if you're launching your book and then you have bloggers writing about your book, and so you're showing up on different blogs, or you're writing on different blogs to promote your book, you can do podcast tours and be a guest on a podcast. A lot of authors do that today because it's such a fun platform. It's interactive. You hear the person's voice. You may see their face if it's a video. It's a very real way to connect with your readers. The benefit is, if you're a guest on a podcast, is you get cross-exposure. So the person's audience of the show that you're on gets exposure to who you are. And then to be a nice guest, of course, a polite guest, you would share that with your audience as well. So if you were going to be a guest on a podcast, you don't want to just show up and leave. It would be like showing up at a party empty-handed, eating and leaving. That would be it, being a rude podcast guest. But as a podcast guest, you want to reciprocate. They're hosting you on the show, so then you therefore promote out on your social media as well. So both parties benefit. The downside to doing podcast guesting is what? You have to find the podcasts, you have to pitch them your idea, and you have to get accepted to be a guest. So that's the work that you do as a guest, is securing the interviews to the podcast where they serve the audience that is most fitting for the books you write about. And that takes a bit of research and a bit of time, and you want to put together your packet that has your one sheet and potential interview questions, and we'll talk about some of those tools in a little bit. But that is the downside. The cross-promotion, though, can sometimes outweigh that. Because if you go to hosting your own podcast, Only 4% of authors have their own podcast, which really surprised me. When I was doing some research for this talk, I thought, wouldn't everybody want to have their own podcast? Because the benefit is you're the star of the show. You get to control who you have on your show. You have the power to interview people. You can reach out to your favorite authors or industry experts or anyone that you have wanted to have a conversation with. And now that conversation has a win-win aspect to it because you are giving them a platform to speak. It's not just like, hey, can I pick your brain for 30 minutes? It's essentially, yeah, I'm picking your brain, but we're doing it publicly and I'm going to share it with all of my people. So it's surprising how many benefits there are to having your own podcast, and I hope to lower the resistance of this 4%. I hope all of you are in the 4%, because it's not that hard to have your own podcast. The downside, of course, is it's something else to promote and grow and do, right? So just like growing your readership, when you write a book, it's work. Growing a podcast is also work. It's something that you have to commit to doing. Like writing a book, how many books might you write in a year? 1, 2, maximum 3, I don't know. But podcasting is something you have to do repeatedly, monthly, every 2 weeks, every week would be great. So that's something that if you get a system going and you understand the benefits of doing it, it can become a way to build your readership and a benefit that gets you out there more often, more regularly. And you get that power to invite, so it's a great reason to talk to other popular authors. So see, these are some of the successful author podcast people that you probably know that I wanted to show you. You've all heard of the book 10% Happier. Has anyone heard of that book? Dan Harris, he's got his own podcast. Freakonomics, we all know the book Freakonomics, right? He's got his own podcast, even does. Gretchen Rubin has Happier. Danny Shapiro actually wrote a memoir and has a podcast called Family Secrets. Malcolm Gladwell, you've all read The Tipping Point, some of his books, has Revisionist History. Tim Ferriss, his iconic book, The 4-Hour Workweek, I know he's done many since then, but he has the Tim Ferriss Show. Interestingly enough, a guest that I recently had on my podcast was on the Tim Ferriss Show, and we were emailing about something, and on her byline, she said, as seen on the Tim Ferriss Show. And so I was like, that was interesting. So I clicked through on her byline, went over, and there was her headshot and her interview from his podcast. So he's getting website traffic through her author signature. Isn't that interesting? So as the podcast host, because she was so proud of being on his show, of course he's got a massive audience, is now regularly driving traffic over to him. Glennon Doyle, who is from my neck of the woods, I'm from Naples, Florida. She also lives in Naples. She wrote the recent book Untamed. She's wrote a lot of other memoir type books, has We Can Do Hard Things, Brene Brown, and Erin Mankey, who I'm going to talk to you for a minute about the Lore podcast. So the story of the Lore podcast, what happened in 2015. So 2015 was not that long ago, 7 years ago. So here he was a graphic designer, hustling on the side, working his little independent graphic design business, and decided to self-publish some books that were thrillers. He really loved to write those kinds of books about sort of like unknown stories, like haunted stories, mysteries, and things like that. But he found that he could only put a couple of these facts and things he was learning into his books. And he had this whole pile of information that he wasn't using for anything. So he was trying to figure out, how do I build my readership? How do I grow my audience? I want to write more. I'm, still working my main job. So he decided he was going to take these stories and write them up as little story sequences and have them as an opt-in on his website. But he found that as he was writing them, it was becoming too many words, and he thought, well, why don't I just record them onto an audio file, and then on my website, I'll put that as an opt-in where I will read them, these pieces of the books that didn't make it in. So he sent this audio recording to his friend, and said, what do you think of this? Do you think I should have this audio opt-in on my website? And the guy was like, this is a podcast. You need to publish this as a podcast. So he was like, a podcast, huh? So he decided to go out on a limb and put these stories, these interesting stories that his readers who were already reading this kind of things into a podcast. And so within 5 months of him launching his podcast in 2015, he was already earning revenue from ad sales on his website or on his podcast. He was growing his readership. He was growing his podcast. And by 2017, he got a traditional publishing deal because his podcast had grown so large. So for those of us who, if you have a dream of getting a traditional publishing deal, a podcast is a route to actually getting there as well. So he, in October of 2017, May 2018, and October 2018, he came out with the World of Lore series. And it says here, and I'm going to read it for those of you who are in the back and can't see, this 3-book series from lore creator Aaron Mahnke gathers rare and fan favorite stories from his hit podcast Lore and combines them with gorgeous illustrations and beautiful typography. Each topical volume presents the tales of our darkest nightmares in an attractive hardcover package that readers will find impossible to put down even when the lights have gone out. Get started today. So podcasting became his door to growing from a self-published author who was just writing as a side hustle to becoming a huge traditionally published success. And this isn't to take away from independent publishing. He certainly could have stayed on that path, but he was able to realize his dream, and that's the main point. He was able to quit his graphic design business and focus full-time on writing because of the success of his podcast. So you might say, why should I have a podcast? And I think I've given you some reasons why I think it's a good idea, but here are some additional. For me, I like to have fun. And so if something's fun, I'm more likely to do it. If something feels like work, I'm less likely to do it. So writing can be a very lonely business, can be a very lonely task, but if you know, oh, I've got a podcast interview with someone coming up, you have a reason to reach out and connect with new people, it gets you out of that behind the desk feeling alone in your writing. It's free. That's another great benefit. So the way I'm going to share with you about how to get a podcast started, there's really no cost involved other than your time and your brain power. The income, you can sell more books, and if your podcast grows, you can solicit advertisers. One thing that I do with my podcast, I don't have outside advertisers, but I put little advertisements in my own podcast that promote my own stuff. So I will interview the guest in a little segment, in an audio segment, where I'll say, today we're hosting Jane Wood. She's the author of blah, blah, blah. She's based in Florida. Let's hop into the interview. And then I'll cut the audio. Then I'll say, but wait, before we get started, go over to O'Leary Publishing and download our free publishing guide. If you've ever wanted to be an author or ever considered it, you can get this free guide to get started today. All right, let's get in. And then I hop into the interview. So it's a great way to kind of put a little side plug in for something that you're doing. Maybe it's an event you're hosting. Maybe it's a new book you're doing. Maybe it's a promotion you're running. So you can be your own advertiser. And it's a way that is kind of fun and upbeat and gets a little bit of sales into your podcast. And of course, meeting cool people, like I said. There's people that I've been able to interview on my podcast who I would have never otherwise met, and who I was able to connect with through LinkedIn or through other authors or through other industry professionals who said yes to speaking with me because when I reached out, I said, hey, love what you're doing. I would love to have you on my podcast. And do you think any one of those people said no? No, they all said yes. So now we're going to get into the worksheet I have there for you. And I wanted to be very simple today with helping you think through ideas about what you could potentially do to create a podcast. There are podcasts that are solo podcasts where you are the only person on the podcast and you're just talking about maybe your writing process in your books, or you can read excerpts from your books. You could do a story hour. There's lots of things you can do. And of course, that's simple because you don't need to schedule time with other people. You can bulk record your interviews with yourself and then have them roll out over time. So it's the easiest way to get started if you're comfortable talking just to open air. I'm comfortable with that. I can, give me a mic and I can just keep talking. Some people don't like that, and they would rather be in the interview seat and have their podcast revolve around an idea that could be a shared experience with their guest. So I want you to define your podcast goal. So why would you want to have a podcast? Would it be to sell more books? Is it because it's fun, like I said? Is it a marketing tool? Is it a way to reach and speak with other people? If we don't understand really why we're going to be doing something, then it's kind of hard to do the what and the how and all of the other things. We all became authors for some reason, right? Why was that reason? Did we have a story we shared? We enjoyed the process of writing. We had the dream to, become super popular or whatever it was. So does anyone want to share why they would want to have a podcast? Does anyone have a why? To sell books. Perfect, to sell books. That's probably the most common. What else?
People ask for it. I have a blog and people ask me all the time, do you have a podcast?
Ah, people ask for it. That's the best way to know, right? If people are asking for it, you got to give them what they want. Yes, in the back?
I'd like to reach new audiences, or at least my target audiences.
Reach new audiences or her target audiences, and who would that be?
Well, for me, because I write children's books, I want to reach parents and grandparents, the teachers specifically.
Yes.
And if I can reach them through a podcast, again, it's like all of the social media and all of those connections. Never thought of that, so.
Yeah, that's perfect. So reaching the audience of people you want to reach and providing some sort of value to them, to educators, to parents, to grandparents. So in Jane's case, she writes books for later elementary students, but those students don't have credit cards. So she understands her buyers are the parents or the grandparents or the teachers. So the podcast could be focused on her buyers, not necessarily trying to get the under 12s, which are not listening to podcasts, to listen to a podcast, right? So then we say what? What is the podcast going to be about? So think about that. So for the I'm Booked podcast, because I'm a publisher, I want to talk about all things that revolve around publishing. So it could be some of my episodes are geared towards hurdles and challenges that writers face when they're trying to write their book. And I interview a lot of authors, and that's one of the things we talk about. I just interviewed a thriller author yesterday, actually. And I don't publish thriller fiction. I don't publish any fiction. I publish only nonfiction. So why would I want a thriller writer on my podcast? Because the challenges that he faces as a writer are no different than the challenges every writer faces. How do you find the time to write? How do you get your ideas? How do you structure them? Do you map things out in advance? Do you work with an editor? How have you worked on marketing your book? What are the things that you've done? How have you grown your readership? So these are all common themes that revolve around writing and publishing. So for you, if you write in a certain genre, what is it you want to talk about? So I'll let you think about that for a second, and then I'd like a few to share, if you wouldn't mind.
Well, again, for me, if I'm trying to reach teachers, I'm going to talk about how the content of my book is applicable to what they're having to teach in the classroom. So I can talk about state standards, which gets complicated because all states have different standards, but they're pretty generic. So you can talk about some of the basics. I'd also talk about the resources that I've created to go along with each of my titles, because they don't know if you don't tell them. So that would be the content I would want to talk about talking to teachers.
That makes sense. And also, when you have an audience of teachers, we want to think about what are the larger problems that our teachers face. It could be just becoming a trusted resource for teachers. So your book is there, you're an author, but you also have decades of experience as a teacher. So it could be that they are coming to you to kind of hear maybe funny stories about when you were teaching, challenges you faced as a teacher. How did you incorporate outside books into your curriculum to make it more interesting for your students? Where would you go for those resources? How do you get your students interested in writing? What are some of the exercises you would do to give them, the students, energy behind the writing experience. So there's so many different avenues to take. And then at the end is, hey, by the way, I've got this book. Don't forget to get it. I'd love to be an author that would come into your classroom in person or via Zoom, and giving them the opportunity. Anyone else have a what? What would they want to talk about on their podcast?
I'm a genetic genealogist, so I would want to talk about the challenges of DNA mapping.
A genetic genealogist. And the challenges of DNA mapping. That is interesting. So who would be your listeners? And I know we're getting now into the who.
Genealogists, readers, researchers, bio.
So it's figuring out the what and also figuring out the who. So who is this going to apply to? Who is going to be most interested? So in the case of my podcast, which is a great marketing tool as well, I think about who would be my aspiring audience would be people who are thinking about writing a book, people who have already written a book, people who want to understand how to market their book, people who are some way circling around this, should I publish a book, could I publish a book, where would I go to publish a book? And so I want to be a resource for that. And I can tell you, I have in-house, I have my own editor, line editor, proofreader, but I don't stick just with that. I've interviewed other editors. I like to provide other resources, so I'm not afraid to say there's lots of people out there, there's lots of publishers out there, there's lots of authors out there, so it's not a echo chamber of only things circling about what we're doing. Because the thing is, I always learn when I talk to other people, and so I use it as a platform to learn and grow myself professionally as well. Does anyone else have like a what and a who? Go ahead.
I've written 40 books on business and self-help and that sort of thing. And so anything to do with trends or tips and suggestions or ways to do things better, save time, whatever, I think is always valuable for people.
Right. So you've written 40 books, and it would be to help people who have already written a book, or people who are wanting to improve their life?
On a specific topic, my latest book is on cruising, for example. I write a cruise blog.
Okay.
So tips on the process of what to expect on a cruise during the cruise.
Okay.
I saved money. During COVID, I posted several articles on how to, what the safety tips were being in place, what to expect when you board a ship, that sort of thing.
I love that. So using the topic of your book on cruising, for example, and then saying, okay, my audience would be people who are cruising, want to cruise, they would maybe already be reading my blog, they would be attracted, and they want to know the ins and the outs of cruising, what to expect to ease their own fears maybe, or their own uncertainties, so that they have a better time cruising. Yeah. It's funny, I encouraged my daughter, who lives here in Orlando, I keep referencing her, but she is a Disney-aholic. She knows everything about Disney. Like last night we went over to Disney Springs and we had to make our way to a certain guest services area because they have this brand new magnet for annual pass holders, and then you can scan this QR code, and when you hold the magnet, then the magnet does all this, it turns into a cartoon essentially on your camera. It's pretty cool. But it's like insider information. And I said, you need to publish a book that's insider information for parents who are bringing their kids to Disney for the first time. Because all this stuff is super new and old hat for you. It seems like, don't people know, like she said, park in the orange parking garage. So for anyone who's going to Disney Springs, don't park in the lime garage, park in the orange garage. Because we drove right past the lime garage because there's a line a mile long, and went right into the orange. And I said, how did you know to do that? She goes, I don't know, everybody just, who lives here knows don't go to Lime. So sometimes the things that we know that we think are so simple, other people find very complicated. Like you went on your first cruise at some point. When was that? When did you go on your very first cruise? 1995. So that's almost 20 years ago, and you've been cruising for 20 years, so I'm sure that the experience you had then, you never knew that today you would be giving other people advice on how to cruise. Yeah.
I actually have a question.
Sure.
In effect, you become a trusted advisor.
Yes.
For information. Are you trying to encourage them to reach out to friends to say, hey, if you want to know about music, go here? What are you doing to expand your audience?
Well, every time we go on a cruise, I always put in the cards and copies of the book. I have many conversations on that, obviously. But otherwise, Facebook, blog, co-authors and travel is network as well. So we're looking at opportunities like this, where people become aware of what we are and who we are, and provide also do Facebook ads and things like that. Try to promote
This is, one of the things that I'm thinking for you as well. And this is where you get kind of the business of podcasting. But someone who's got a specific topic like that, you could reach out to cruise companies to ask them to buy ads on your podcast. Because someone who is interested in learning about how to cruise, they would be very interested to hear an ad about cruising, right? So this is how the strategy comes to how do I reach out to who are the players that this podcast would benefit. Yes. Go ahead.
I had a question on that. How many listeners do you need to start attracting advertisers? Is there a magic number? And do I have to go through an intermediary to get to them?
I would say that it's probably different in all respects. It's sort of like, for example, we have all of our vendors here today who we really appreciate being here, and they know that by coming here, they're going to connect with people who are interested in what they have to offer. We don't have 1,000 people at our conference, but it's a valuable enough audience, excuse me, that they would want to spend their time and money to be here. And the same is true with the podcast.
So not to steal from the but I'll just share with you. I represent one of the largest technology companies servicing the publishing industry. And in 2021, we started a podcast. Well, why would a technology company start a podcast? Well, we belong to all sorts of associations, we sponsor events, we really grow a publishing industry, we want to see it grow, and things like that. So we started our podcast, inviting notable people from different facets of the industry who had something to say, who were passionate about something. And last year, the beginning of this year, we were only up for 1 year, we were voted one of the top 20 podcasts in the publishing industry. And we just, the way we started, because you always need a vendor, a mentor, was we reached out to a guy by the name of Bradley Medrock. He's an author, and he also runs something called Project Voice, which has 400,000 followers. He gave us some tips about how to start a podcast. And then from then on, it was just me recruiting different people. And as long as I'm here today, I can't promise that I'll put you on my podcast. But if any of you would like to stop by my table in the next day or two and tell me they have something that they're passionate talking about, I'll think about putting you on our podcast. We're on 21 different channels. Most of our listeners are on Simplecast, as you probably experienced. And it's been a really interesting ride. And we try at the end of the podcast to make it personal. I don't know if you've done this, but at the end of the podcast, we ask questions like, tell us a phrase in any language that you really appreciate. Who are 2 people you'd invite to dinner, dead or alive, that you really respect? What's your way of relaxing? And just sort of get personal. And some of the answers that have come out of that are really interesting. So again, I didn't mean to trample on your...
No, it's great. No, I appreciate it. And the podcasting experience is no different than the author experience. They're so parallel. Is that putting your podcast out there, you never know what's going to happen, right? You kind of just get started and you say like, all right, well, I'm getting in the boat and I'm going in the water and I'm not really sure what direction I'm heading, but at least I'm in the boat, right? At least I'm doing something. And then lots of great things can come. So to answer your question, you know, if you want to have a podcast geared towards cruising, as we said, you know, it wouldn't make sense to reach out to, you know, a shoe company necessarily. So it would say, like, sometimes the smaller niche audiences are actually more valuable to advertisers. They can be. And it's creating the win-win. You know, like, how are you going to promote them? In what ways? Is it just an ad spot? Is it an affiliate relationship where you're sending them there and they're typing in a code to get a discount? You know, all of that is just very nuanced. Yes. 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 Mm-hmm. That's amazing. So 315 shows, you know, it can take time to build up enough steam and to hit that magical number. And I don't know what that number is either. I'm not here to pretend that I am like a podcasting expert. I would still say I'm learning all the time. I'm growing. I'm, you know, growing my own podcast, and I'm seeing the benefits of it. And my goal today is to just say, get in the boat and do it, and here's how. And so congratulations, though, on 315 episodes. That's amazing. Yes. It's amazing, and it's so fun to find that those, you know, certain shows will really go well, some shows aren't as popular, and so it's really just staying with it and just being consistent with producing them. There are certain times where I've only done one episode a month because I was really busy working on other projects, and then I'll be like, oh my God, I got to do a podcast, you know, like, you know, it's one of those things. And then there's other times where, you know, I've tried to plan it ahead. So like right now I have 3 podcasts sitting in my dock, like that are ready to go that I haven't released yet. And I have 2 more that I recorded yesterday that I still need to edit. So it's like I'm learning how to manage my time better and to make things easier on myself. And we're going to talk a little bit about the how, because that's where I think people get most tripped up in, well, what's the tool? So these are some sample goals, and I did this just because I wanted you to fill out your page, and I want you to feel like when you left you had an idea of what it was you were going to do. So potential goal could be the possibility to connect with more potential readers. That could be a great goal. An opportunity to meet people or to interview people I admire and cross-promote. You know, so that's a great reason to do it. And maybe I'd like to host a show and feature guests. So making the decision, do I want to do a solo show or do I want to be a host and host other people? My show's a combination. Sometimes I do it myself and sometimes I have guests. More often than not I have guests, but sometimes if I don't have a guest scheduled and I know I need to put a podcast out, I'll just record a quick 20 minutes. I'll think about what have I been working on lately and what are some tips I could offer. And it's easy to just record straight into the app. And creating more income. So selling more books, selling ads to your show, increasing the website traffic to other offers. If you have courses or other things that are downloadable, that's always a good goal. So this is tips for new hosts. Okay, this is getting into the how. So picking a format. How long for each episode? Because you want things to be somewhat of a rhythm and predictable. Do you want to do a 10-minute show and produce them more regularly? Are you like the Joe Rogan experience, and he's the #1 podcast right now. I don't know if you've heard of him or his show. Could go on for hours and hours and people will listen, you know, or somewhere in between. The most popular length of podcasting is about a half an hour. So anywhere between 20 and 40 minutes is the most popular. It's sort of the reverse bell, the bell curve, where you've got like the 10 minutes here, you've got the up to like 30 minutes, and then when it gets to an hour, it's, drops off again. So you want to think about that. How long do I want to do it? I would encourage you to search podcasts. So if you're not super familiar with podcasts and what's out there, it's very much like writing a book. What's in the genre? If you were going to write a thriller book, what's popular right now in the thriller category? What's popular in fiction? What's popular in, are there any cruise books that are popular? So I would search for podcasts and see what is already out there and see what's the format of those shows. How long are they? Who's doing them? Go to their website. Do a little bit of your own research on the market of the podcast you think you want to do, because you may get ideas that are like, oh, I wouldn't have thought of that. That's a cool idea, or I like that. Or you might say, you know what, before I jump in and do my own podcast, I'm going to reach out and be a guest on these podcasts and see how that goes. So it's always great to be a guest, and you can do both. I've been guests on podcasts, I'm still guests on podcasts, and I also have my own show. So it's not uncommon to have your own show, but also like swap interviews. Like I'll be on your show, you be on my show. Scheduling, how often do you plan to release an episode? And we're going to get into some slides about how, like samples, calendars for scheduling, which I think are kind of helpful to do if you're the type of person that likes to check things off and know, like, where am I going with this? Be entertaining. I can't stress this enough, because podcasting, we're dealing with people's free time, mostly. Time when they're driving, time when they're maybe working out, or they're sitting on their back patio. So this is something that's not school anymore. If you're not entertaining, they're not going to listen. So we want to have some laughs. We want to have interesting topics, have good guests, do something that's going to people want to come back. And be willing to teach yourself along the way. So this is like my number one tip is everything is learnable. Everything is figure outable. So don't get stuck in the weeds of the technology. Google can be a really good, helpful tool. And I always say, I might not be the smartest person on the planet, but I'm definitely not the dumbest. So if someone else can put out a podcast, I'm pretty sure I could figure it out. And so I take that mindset with me a lot into a lot of things that I do. And I know that I can do just as well as somebody else. And you always start somewhere, right? And then launching with success, one episode is better than none. So getting the first episode out there is always better than sitting at the drawing board and waiting. To that end, I will say that launching a podcast, and I missed this opportunity because I didn't know about it, but there are strategies to launching a podcast successfully, to getting notable new release kind of a thing. And you can Google that. We're not going to go into those kinds of strategies for launching podcasts, but it includes having multiple episodes to release on the first day. So let's say you want to put 5 or 10 episodes out, like bam, and then you collect all your audience. You're letting everybody know my podcast is launching, and they all subscribe and download those episodes on the same day. So that's one way to sort of get yourself like visible right out of the gates. I'm not saying that you need to do that, but I know that there are a lot of podcast launch strategies that do kind of get you more visibility right out of the gate. So here's where I would say the listen and learn, finding the most popular podcasts in your category. So do sort of a chart for yourself, and I just made this as a sample. So when you go back to your hotel room, or when you go home and you decide, I'm going to do this podcast thing and I want to see who's out there right now, find the top 5 or 6 shows that are in your category and just listen to at least one episode and say, is it excellent? Is it good? Is it fair? What did they do well? What did they not do well? How can I learn from that? And these become your allies, and they also your competitors. So you can gain a lot of information just by doing some research. Podcast graphics. This is an important thing. Have you all used Canva? Okay, Canva is a very simple. So podcast graphics are square, anywhere from 1,400 pixels to 3,000 pixels. And you can design them yourself. You could hire a designer. Just wanted to show you some. This is mine. On the top, I had, I took that photo of myself in my office with my iPhone on a timer. So it wasn't even like a professional photo or anything. And then I just did that because I thought, you know what, I wanted to be branded. I did this so it was branded with my company here. And I wanted to be a resource in the publishing industry. So of all of these, mine is the only one that really represents more of a company. You can see Glennon Doyle, she has her face on it. She's a very recognizable face in her book genre. So she did that. The other ones are just mostly graphics. So you don't have to have a photo of yourself or picture to be on there. And you can see that their names are on there. So you want to have your name also on the graphic. So I would encourage you to think about what's the brand that you have, what's your branding, and try to match that. Try to make it similar, just like you would hire an interior designer to help you with your house potentially. The brand graphic that you use for your podcast should be somewhat similar to maybe how you design your books and how the brand is that you represent. Now, how to produce, this is the nuts and bolts of how you go about doing it. And I'm going to show you some of the equipment that I use as well, which is very inexpensive, so you don't need to blow a lot of money to actually have a good, high-quality podcast. The first thing you'll do, there's an app, and this is the app I use, and I have a QR code at the end so you can scan it and get the whole presentation and just download it, so you don't need to worry about the slides. Anchor FM is the app. It's a purple square. I'll show you the image on the next slide. And it is the best tool for podcasting that I've found because it's free. You can record directly in the podcast. You can import audio into the podcast. They have pre-done sort of backup tracks. So you can, let's say for my podcast, I usually do it in 3 audio segments. The main chunk is the interview. So let's say we did our interview over Zoom. I just extract the audio and I use there's another app called Media Converter, which you'll want to have. For some reason, if you record over Zoom, the audio file that they download is called an M3A or something like that. It's not like a real, it's not a recognizable audio file. Anchor recognizes it as a video file. So if you use Media Converter, so you convert it to an MP3, and then you just dump that into Anchor. Okay, so I've got my main chunk of my interview. And so I always say to my guest, right, so for example, hey Jane, thank you for being on the show. This is before I hit the record button. Just so you know, I'm going to read your bio before this segment cuts in. So I'm just going to start by talking to you. So I do their whole, Jane is a best-selling author, she's a blah, 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 whatever, their whole thing. I do that prior to the segment. I don't record it prior to the segment, but it goes in prior to that large audio file, right? So I've got the interview that I do on Zoom. That usually is about 25 to 30 minutes. Then after that's over, I use the Anchor app and there's a record button. I just talk right into my iPhone and I say, welcome to the iBook podcast. I'm April Leary. This is episode 52. Today I'm talking to Jane Wood. We're talking about writing children's books, and it was such a fun interview. We talked about this, we talked about that. Let's get started. So that little 30-second to 1-minute segment, I record after we do our interview because then I can kind of prime the listener about what we're going to talk about, if that makes sense. Does that make sense? And then from that audio file, you can put the backup track or whatever you want, so some upbeat little riff, and it'll just put it right overlaid on that file. So you've got like your fun music intro, and then it cuts into your main interview. Do you have a question? Dun, dun, dun. I think it's the actual somehow. Yeah, you'll get don't worry, I'll get the whole presentation. Yeah. So recording, you can record inside the app. You can record by importing. You can record outside of the app using Zoom or some other recording, however you like to record files. And then you can import it into the app. So there's a couple different ways to do it. Importing the audio, and I'm going to look here and see. So yeah, you're converting the file. So you convert the file using the media converter, which I mentioned to you. And the one thing that I'll say with using Anchor that is, it has helped me save time, because I'm pretty quick typing on my phone with my thumbs, but not a lot of people are. But it doesn't have the functionality when you do the show description to hit return inside of their platform. So if you can type up your show description in like Google Docs or somewhere, you know, outside of the platform, to where you could just copy it from your phone, from say Google Drive, and then when you go into the show description, just paste it so it's already done. So that's the easiest way I've found to do the description, and having all the hyperlinks. And a lot of times in podcasts they say, you know, make sure you go to the show notes, the link is there, or whatever. So include your guests' links to their website or their book or their, you know, whatever they're promoting at the time, and also include links to whatever you're doing. So I always have, be sure to download the Influencer's Path to Successful Publishing on our website. That's on every single one. Another cool thing with Anchor that I like, I haven't used it much, but they do have that feature available. I don't promote it, which is probably why I haven't used it, but they have where your listeners can click a link and record a voice message that will send to your Anchor account. So for example, they can say, I really love your show, I loved what you talked about, blah, 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 whatever. And so you can put in like listener testimonials, because they can send in their own audio files to you. So as I said, I have not done that. I have not promoted that. I should promote that. Okay, so the podcast equipment. Now you can see here I'm wearing a little microphone, this one. I have this connected to my iPhone here, which is recording the live stream. And you can see all there is, this is a little Bluetooth adapter, and this is recorded. And there's two of those. So I got this little, I'll show you. Comes like this, and it is two lavalier mics and an adapter for your iPhone. So if you were going to do an interview with a guest and you wanted to be at a distance from your phone, but you want the audio to be clear, I got this for $30 on Amazon. Super cheap. You can use, if you have AirPods, if you have an iPhone, or any sort of a Bluetooth device, you can use that to record also with your phone. You have Zoom, you know, on your phone as well. You can use that. A lot of times I just use a webcam. So my webcam has a built-in mic, and the audio quality is not an A+, but it's sufficient. You know, I have a quiet office, and I'm uninterrupted and no background noise, and so it does an okay job. So if you have a webcam that has a mic on it, you could start there. You don't have to go buy anything fancy. One thing I will say that I highly, highly recommend is getting a ring light. This is just like a mini ring light, but you can see it when you're doing a video, especially a video podcast recording, or any video that you're going to do, whether you're doing a Facebook Live, Instagram Live, or whatever. This makes you look like, I look like $1 million. You really do feel like it makes a major difference to have good lighting. This one has a cell phone clip on it. So, you know, this travels, obviously. I traveled with it here. And it's super simple, and it has a USB plug-in. So you could plug it straight into your computer, or you can use a plug-in adapter. So do yourself a favor. It's the only $50 you spend this year. Get a ring light. It's so worth it. On the picture that was part of my podcast graphic, that bigger mic, which I didn't bring today because it's heavy, it's called a Blue Yeti. That's a USB Bluetooth mic, not Bluetooth, it's a USB. It's about $200. It's super high quality mic, and it has a way to signal where you want it to record around the top. So if you and I were doing a podcast recording, it would have picking up on the front, picking up on the back, and it would turn off the sides. You know, you can have it be omnidirectional, you could have it be singular. So that's like, if you're really focused on like high quality audio, that's a great way to go. And then you want to decide on the platform, how are you going to record it? Are you going to do Zoom? Do you want to record directly in the Anchor app? Do you want to use voice memo? Like you can use a voice memo app on your phone and just record it and then just put the audio in. It's just how do you want to get the file? It doesn't matter where, it doesn't matter how, you just need the audio files, and then start with the basic streaming service. And then one more thing about Anchor, and I should be being paid to like tell you all this about Anchor, but they have a way where you can grab the streaming code, the CSS code, and it will give you a way to paste that code onto your website so you can have a live podcast player right embedded on your website. So it has the whole stream there, but it also streams to every podcast platform for free. So my podcast is on Spotify, Apple iTunes, Google Play, Spreaker, Podbean, I don't even know all the other ones it's on. But the lion's share of podcast listeners listen on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. That accounts for about 60% of listeners listen on those two platforms. So you want to make sure that however you go about doing it, you hit those the main platforms. Now the podcast scheduling, this is just a sample, and I did one sample that is producing a show every other week and one that's producing every week. So if you were going to say, I want to have shows that release on 2 Fridays a month. So what you might do is you would get your idea on, let's say, that Monday, preparation, do any research you might need to research, and then I'm going to record on Thursdays. So Thursday is my recording day. Then the following week, give yourself some time. To be honest with you, now that I know my what for my show, or I know my show's 30 minutes, I know I do the intro audio segment, I do the outro audio segment, and the lion's share is the interview right in the middle. I can audio edit my show from my phone in probably about 15 minutes. So it's not a huge time commitment. I don't get into toggling with any sort of, whatever you might think of, like a big soundboard. There's no functionality for that. You just need a good audio file, and that's it. And I don't have a podcast, some people are like, go to the podcast studio. Like I was just on a podcast for a gal who lives in Naples, and she started a show. She owns the largest designer resale shop in the state of Florida. So I was on her show, and she actually rents out podcast studio time. So it was like the thing where you've got the big mics and the person behind the desk with 3 computer monitors, and I was like, wow, this is really impressive, but like super unnecessary to me for what I need a podcast for, right? So so you can do the audio editing, writing the show description and all of that earlier in the next week, and then publish it on Friday, and then of course promote it out to your social networks, like you said, LinkedIn. You have to have a way to get it out and share it. If you were going to do every week, and this is like with an interview show, you could have Mondays your day to invite guests. So not just inviting one guest, but have an email template where you said like, hey, I noticed, you're talking about this. I'd love to have you on my show. Hit me up, if you're interested. So you're booking the guests, preparing for the interview Tuesday, recording Wednesday. So this kind of area of the map doesn't mean the guest I invite on Monday, I'm preparing for on Tuesday, and I'm recording them on Wednesday. This is just a way to block your time to invite potential guests. And then in your calendar, these are the times I'm recording. So if I already have someone I'm recording on the 3rd, I might book them for the 17th or the 31st. So it doesn't have to be this week 1 is all related to that show, if that makes sense. Yeah? Okay. And then the preparing, recording, editing, publishing. So you want to create a weekly schedule. And here's my bonus tips for you, my challenge for you. If you're really going to be part of the 4% of people, 4% of authors who have a podcast, is challenge yourself with every episode. So episode 1, talk about yourself. Who are you? What is this show about? Give people a warm-up because they need to understand what it is they can expect from the show. Episode 2, nail your first topic. So whatever topic it is or whatever guest you're having, just feel like confident that you want to just dive in there and get it and relax. Just relax. Nobody ever died creating a podcast. I always say no one dies in publishing that I'm aware of. So like nobody dies in podcasting. If the episode sucks, who cares? You'll record episode 3 and you'll get better. Number 3, episode 3, challenge yourself to add in a plug for your website or your book. Add a little something each time to make it better and better, right? Episode 4, work out any kinks. If you feel like the audio's not sounding so good, maybe your webcam microphone isn't sufficient. Maybe you need to get a better mic. Maybe you've had people that have said, you know, the way the files are, you know, I don't know. There's lots of ways people can give you feedback, or it might be great. You might not have any audio issues, but upgrade if you need to, because one of the main reasons people won't come back is if it's boring or if the audio quality is bad. Those are your 2 like deal killers. Episode 5, check your statistics. Do you have a few listeners? Have you shared it on LinkedIn? Are you starting to see people coming, right? Thank people for coming. Invite them to like, comment, subscribe, send in a review, send in a voice recording. Encourage people to connect with you in other ways so that you can understand who your listener is. Especially when you're small, you can really make the personal touch available. And episode 6 is, I would say, reflect on what is this doing for me? Because when we're going to invest our time and our energy to do something, we want to know there's a return for us. Am I seeing a little bit more website traffic? Have I sold a couple more books? Am I having fun? Am I enjoying talking to new people? Give yourself a pat on the back and just realize that like this is doing something, maybe marketing tool for myself, maybe a way to reach advertisers that is it worth continuing doing? But give yourself 6 episodes to kind of figure things out. And so this is my last plug here to say it's your turn to create, and we're doing good on time. So if 90% of people, 90% of USA Today bestselling authors have a presence on podcasts, that means they're a guest. Are you willing to do that? Are you willing to at least be a guest on a podcast? And if so, all you need to do is create a one sheet. Do you all have one sheets already? Do you know what a one sheet is? Okay, a one sheet is one sheet of paper, and it is your headshot, your book cover, a little bio of who you are, and a sample of interview questions someone could ask you. So make it easy for your host to say yes to having you on. So when I have somebody on my podcast, I'm not going to spend 2 hours researching about who they are. I want them to tell me, what is it you want me to ask you about? What are you an expert in? What things are you promoting right now? And I let them tell me what they want to talk about. And it makes it easier for everybody. So that would be being a guest. So this is the Anchor FM. This is what it looks like. So if you have service in here on your cell phone, then download it now. I encourage you. So 50% of the work is understanding the app and how it works. So when you get into the app, you'll see this button in the middle, on the bottom middle, called Tools. And I snipped this. This is the exact button. It's purple with a white plus. When you click that, it pops up a menu, and you can slide it to the right and to the left, and it gives you all the options about recording, inputting files, and how to kind of run the whole thing. It's very plug and play. It's not hard. And then the 4%, if you are in the 4%, you'll really do it. You won't just download the app and check out the tools. You'll go into Canva and you'll create your podcast graphic. So that means you're really ready to dive in, and I hope you will. And to get you really started, I wanted to offer this. I wanted to say, if you'd like to be a guest on my podcast, I've made it very easy. This is something, if you wanted to talk about the writing process, if you want to talk about the challenges you face as a writer, anything to do with publishing, then you could be a guest on my show. We don't do promotions about specifics on someone's particular book, but we talk more about writing and publishing in general. So if that's something you'd like to try out, on my website, if you go to o'learypublishing.com/podcast, and you'll scroll down, you'll see that Anchor FM streaming player. Right below that, you'll see this green button. Looks exactly like this. It says Be a Guest on the iBook Podcast. You'll click it, and then it'll show you a calendar, and you can schedule yourself. So you schedule a time that you want to be on, that we would have time to record, and it'll ask you some questions. Who are you? Your website? What do you want to talk about? Give me some sample questions, and then you'll be scheduled and we'll record. So that's a fun way that we can get connected and try it out together. I really, really want to encourage you to do it. That's why I wanted to open this up to you to say, if you're not quite sure you want to step in and do your own podcast right away, come be a guest on mine. Lower your guard, feel like, okay, this feels okay, I can do this. And I encourage you to push you off of the high dive and get you into the deep end of the pool. So, and this here, by the way, these are all of the platforms that Anchor streams onto: Overcast, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Radio Public, Breaker, Pocket Cast, Apple Podcasts. So on my website, I have it all linked so that when someone gets there, they can listen on the website. But let's say they have an iPhone, they could click that button and it'll open their Apple Podcast straight to my show. So that's something that once you create your show in Anchor, it gives you that CSS feed, and then it will give you the feed for all of those various platforms. So this, if you want to hold up your phone, you can scan the QR code and that will give you the whole presentation. It'll take you there and you can just download it straight to your phone. And does anyone have any questions or things that they'd like to talk about podcast-wise? Yes.
Two questions. My concern has always been, where do you store all this recording that you're doing? What happens to it once you record it?
When I record the interview initially, or where is it all right now?
Both.
Well, I use Google Drive. I'm a Google Drive addict. My entire business is on Google Drive. So I have a folder for podcasts, and when I download my Zoom audio files or video files, I just store them in there. I pay for extra storage. And once it's in the Anchor app, Anchor hosts all of it. So all of the audio files are inside of Anchor, and however they manage their own thing, I don't know. I don't pay for it, which is amazing.
So do they own copyright to everything you're putting out there?
I don't think so.
Because it's on their platform, I think
No. Yeah, it's just distribution. And you can oh, you need the code. I'm standing in your way. Yeah. And you can actually, in Anchor, they have commercials that you can record for Anchor that you can put on there and monetize it yourself. So let's say I didn't want to monetize my own sending people to my website or whatever. I can read a script that they'll give me and then monetize my app, to your point, monetize it, and then they'll pay you. I mean, it's pennies, really not very much, but if you grow a big enough audience, you can capitalize on promoting Anchor, as a sponsor of your show. You're just reading the script they told you.
The second question is, talking about editing, is that all done in Anchor?
Yes.
And is there a tutorial, I assume, that walks you through all that? It's one thing to say, go out and edit it.
Really? Okay, so here's what I've learned about editing. The only thing I do in Anchor is adjust the starting and ending points of any audio. So if your audio sucks, there's no editing you can do in Anchor that's going to make it better. You just got to need clear audio that you're importing into there. And ideally, the file that you're going to use, the only thing you would do is if there was some, say you click the record button too early and then we're just talking and it's not relevant to the interview, and then I'm like, oh crap, let's get started, and then all I would do is when I upload it into Anchor, I'd slide the bar over to chop off the front end. That's really the extent of any editing I've done. I do I record the intro and the outro, and then I put some, little music clips in there, which is all right in there. And it's very easy, user-friendly. You'll say you want to add audio, you want to add music, it gives you some prompts. Pretty simple. I think we're at time here. Thank you so much. If you have any other questions or if you'd like to be a guest, I invite you to do it.